Sometimes the most important signals are not announced publicly. They are whispered quietly inside organizations where decisions actually form. When people hear the phrase "Ripple Insider Whisper," they imagine secrets or leaks, but the reality is far more subtle and far more powerful. Insiders rarely whisper predictions. They whisper expectations, and expectations shape preparation. Preparation shapes behavior, and behavior is what moves markets. Not headlines, not opinions, not social media, arguments. Welcome back to Crypto Equation, where we decode the future of money by paying attention to structure, behavior, and incentives rather than noise. Today, we are unpacking why the idea that XRP could become unbelievably valuable is not born from hype, but from an internal shift in how relevance is being understood. This is not about price targets, it is about role, and role determines value far more reliably than sentiment ever will. To understand why this matters, we need to start with what insiders actually see that outsiders do not. Insiders do not see charts first. They see usage, they see conversations between institutions. They see pilot programs evolve into planning discussions, and they see where friction exists in real systems. Friction is expensive and eliminating. Friction is where value is created. XRP was never designed to impress retail traders. It was designed to remove friction from global value transfer, and friction still exists at enormous scale across the financial system. Trillions of dollars remain trapped in nostro vostro account settlement. Times stretch for days, risk accumulates during delays, and capital efficiency remains far below what modern technology allows. Insiders understand that this inefficiency is no longer tolerable in a world that demands speed, transparency, and resilience. This is where whispers begin. Not because someone is predicting a price, but because someone is recognizing inevitability. Inevitability does not mean certainty of outcome, it means certainty of pressure. Pressure forces change even when people resist it. Legacy systems resist change because change threatens revenue models, but resistance only delays adoption. It does not prevent it. And delayed adoption often results in abrupt transitions. Once pressure exceeds tolerance, insiders see this coming long before the public, because they are exposed to the constraints directly. They attend meetings where inefficiencies are discussed, not as theories, but as operational problems. They see timelines, budgets, and risk assessments. They see where current systems strain under load and where alternatives offer relief. This is why the phrase unbelievably valuable emerges, not because of speculative excitement, but because value follows necessity. When an asset becomes necessary, its valuation framework changes completely. It stops being compared to other speculative assets and starts being compared to the cost of inefficiency. It replaces, and the cost of inefficiency in global finance is massive. The public struggles with this idea because they are trained to think of value in terms of popularity, market cap, or past price behavior. Insiders think in terms of throughput reliability and risk mitigation. These are different lenses, and they produce very different conclusions. This disconnect explains why public sentiment around XRP can remain skeptical while internal conversations grow increasingly serious. Skepticism does not prevent preparation. It only delays public understanding, and that delay is where asymmetry lives. Asymmetry exists when different participants operate with different information and incentives. Insiders are incentivized to prepare quietly. Retail participants are incentivized to seek validation through price movement. This difference in incentive leads to very different behavior. Insiders do not need price to move to justify preparation. They need readiness. Readiness includes regulatory engagement, infrastructure maturity, and integration feasibility, all of which have progressed significantly in recent years, not loudly but consistently. This is why the whisper matters, because it reflects a shift from exploration to expectation. Expectation does not guarantee outcome, but it drives allocation of resources. And resource allocation is the earliest stage of repricing. The market often ignores this stage because it does not produce immediate price action, but price is a lagging indicator. Relevance is a leading one. The market only reprices after relevance becomes undeniable. But by then, the opportunity to position early has passed. This is why insiders often sound calm, while the public sounds emotional. They are operating on different timelines. The idea of unbelievable value sounds outrageous. If you assume XRP remains a niche speculative asset, it sounds reasonable if you assume XRP becomes a critical component of settlement. Infrastructure, critical components are not priced based on enthusiasm. They are priced based on failure cost. What happens? If the system cannot move value efficiently, the answer is disruption, lost trust, and massive economic cost. Insiders understand that preventing failure is worth paying for. This is why infrastructure spending often looks excessive to outsiders, but essential to those responsible for system stability. XRP offers a solution that reduces failure risk by enabling rapid settlement without pre-funding. And that reduction in risk carries value far beyond transaction fees. It impacts balance sheets, liquidity planning, and systemic resilience. These are not abstract concepts. They are core concerns for financial institutions, especially in times of volatility, stress, and geopolitical uncertainty. Insiders feel this pressure directly because they are accountable for outcomes, not narratives. This accountability drives seriousness. Seriousness drives preparation, and preparation eventually drives adoption. Adoption does not require public enthusiasm, it requires functionality. This is why XRP can remain controversial publicly while becoming valuable privately. Value and popularity are not the same thing, and markets eventually reconcile the two, but only after mispricing has persisted long enough to create opportunity. The whisper that XRP could be unbelievably valuable should be interpreted as recognition that the asset is moving into a different category, not better or worse, but different assets follow different valuation rules, and those rules often surprise people who cling to outdated frameworks. Insiders adapt frameworks when roles change, the public adapts frameworks when price forces them to, and that lag explains why so many people feel blindsided by repricing events. They were using the wrong lens until it was too late. The transition XRP is undergoing is from debated concept to evaluated infrastructure. And infrastructure evaluation is methodical, quiet, and deeply analytical. It does not play out on social media, it plays out in spreadsheets, risk models, and pilot results. Those processes are not exciting, but they are decisive. Once completed, they create momentum that is difficult to stop, because systems do not easily abandon infrastructure once adopted. This is why insiders care less about short-term volatility and more about long-term reliability. Reliability creates stickiness. Stickiness creates demand, and demand constrained by fixed supply creates upward pressure. This is not a promise. It is a structural dynamic that appears repeatedly across industries. When technology replaces inefficiency, the value accrues to those positioned before consensus forms. The whisper is not meant to excite, it is meant to acknowledge a trajectory. Trajectory does not guarantee destination, but it narrows possibilities, and insiders are very sensitive to narrowing possibilities because it affects planning. When insiders begin to speak in terms of expectation rather than possibility, it signals that internal models have reached a level of confidence that warrants attention, not action necessarily, but attention. Ignoring such signals, because they are not loud, is a mistake many retail participants make because they equate volume with importance. Insiders equate feasibility with importance. Feasibility is growing, and that growth is what underpins the idea of unbelievable value. Not a number on a chart, but a role in a system that cannot afford to fail. In the next part, we will go deeper into how this shift in role changes distribution access and market behavior, why insiders think in terms of scarcity differently than retail, and how whispers turn into outcomes long before headlines ever catch up. When insiders begin to adjust how they think about scarcity, the market is already late. Scarcity is not just about total supply, it is about accessible supply, and insiders understand this distinction very clearly. Accessible supply is what matters in operational planning, because systems cannot rely on assets that are not available when needed. This is why custody behavior changes before valuation does. Insiders are not speculating on price. They are securing availability. Securing availability reduces circulating liquidity, and that reduction quietly alters market structure long before price reacts. The public often misinterprets this because they focus on visible metrics like trading volume and daily price movement. Insiders focus on settlement capacity, corridor reliability, and stress performance under peak conditions. These are the metrics that determine whether an asset can scale into infrastructure roles, once an asset begins to be evaluated. Through this lens, the question stops being, how cheap is it, and becomes, how reliable is it? Reliability requires redundancy requires inventory, and inventory requires supply that is not constantly traded. This is why assets transitioning into infrastructure roles often experience a slow drain from speculative venues into custodial and operational environments. This drain does not generate headlines, but it fundamentally changes how the market behaves under pressure. Lower available liquidity means price reacts more sharply to incremental demand. This is not manipulation, it is mechanics, and mechanics are indifferent to belief. The whisper about unbelievable value reflects this mechanical reality. Insiders see a future where XRP is not optional but required. In certain flows, required assets are not valued emotionally. They are valued defensively. Institutions ask what happens if we do not have access, and what happens if access is constrained. Those questions lead to precautionary positioning. Increases demand before necessity becomes obvious. This creates a feedback loop where preparation itself accelerates scarcity, and scarcity amplifies valuation potential. The public often misses this loop because it is not intuitive. They expect cause and effect to be linear, but markets operate reflexively. Anticipation affects outcomes and outcomes. Validate anticipation. Insiders are trained to think this way because risk management depends on it. Waiting for certainty is considered irresponsible when system failure is the downside. This is why insiders tolerate ambiguity while preparing for worst-case scenarios. The public tends to avoid ambiguity and wait for clarity. Clarity arrives after the window for advantageous positioning has closed. This difference in tolerance for uncertainty is one of the biggest divides between institutional and retail behavior, and it explains why insiders often appear calm during periods of doubt and skeptical during periods of euphoria. They are not driven by emotion, they are driven by obligation. Obligation to ensure continuity, stability, and efficiency. XRP's design aligns with those obligations because it addresses settlement, inefficiencies directly rather than indirectly. This is why whispers emerge inside organizations, not because of excitement, but because of alignment. Alignment between problem and solution is what drives adoption, and adoption is what drives value, then feeds back into perception, but perception lags adoption, which is why price often moves faster than understanding. Once repricing begins, those who dismiss the asset struggle to reconcile the move with their prior beliefs. This cognitive dissonance leads to rationalizations, accusations, and conspiracy theories because it is easier to believe the market is wrong than to admit a framework was outdated. The whisper about unbelievable value is uncomfortable because it challenges the assumption that XRP's future must resemble its past. Insiders do not assume continuity. They assume change because systems are constantly under pressure to improve this mindset. Difference is critical. The market punishes those who extrapolate the present indefinitely and rewards those who anticipate structural shifts. XRP represents a structural shift, not because it is perfect, but because it solves a problem that cannot be ignored. Indefinitely, the problem of slow, expensive, and risky cross-border settlement grows. As global trade becomes more interconnected and volatile, pressure on legacy systems increases during stress events, and those events are becoming more frequent, not less. This increases the urgency for alternatives that can operate under extreme conditions. Insiders feel this urgency because they are responsible for outcomes when things break. Responsibility drives seriousness, seriousness drives preparation, and preparation drives value, long before headlines catch up. This is why insiders rarely speak in absolutes, they speak in trajectories. They understand that systems evolve through phases, and that the most dangerous phase is the one where change is inevitable but not yet visible. This phase creates the greatest opportunity and the greatest risk opportunity for those who position early risk for those who disengage due to boredom or skepticism. The whisper is a signal that XRP is entering this phase more decisively than before, not because of one announcement or one integration, but because multiple forces are converging. Regulatory engagement, infrastructure, maturity, and institutional necessity. Convergence is powerful because it reduces optionality. Optionality allows delay. Convergence forces action. Once action begins, markets adjust quickly, and those adjustments feel shocking only to those who were not watching the convergence. This is why the idea of unbelievable value should not be taken literally as a price claim. It should be taken structurally as recognition that valuation frameworks are shifting. When frameworks shift, outcomes change dramatically, even if timelines remain uncertain. Insiders prepare for this by securing access modeling scenarios and reducing exposure to surprise. The public often reacts to surprise rather than preparing for it. Preparation is quiet. Reaction is loud. This difference in behavior is visible in how insiders speak cautiously, while commentators speak dramatically. The whisper is cautious. It is not excitement. It is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the asset is no longer just an idea, but a candidate for real use. Real use changes everything because it creates baseline demand, independent of sentiment. Sentiment can fade. Usage cannot. Once systems rely on an asset, they must maintain access, regardless of public opinion. This is where long-term value emerges, not from belief, but from dependency. Dependency is the strongest form of demand because it is not discretionary. This is why infrastructure assets tend to experience sustained value. Once adoption reaches critical mass, they become boring again, but at a much higher valuation. Boring at scale is far more valuable than exciting at the margins. The path from whisper to reality is not linear. It includes volatility, setbacks, and skepticism, but the direction is shaped by necessity rather than hype. Those who understand this do not need to be convinced emotionally, they need to observe structurally. Observation reveals that XRP is being evaluated differently today than it was in the past, and evaluation precedes adoption. Adoption precedes repricing. Repricing precedes narrative acceptance. This order rarely changes, and those who expect narrative acceptance first will always be late. The whisper is not meant to persuade the masses. It is meant to acknowledge a shift among those closest to the system. The masses follow later because they respond to price, not structure. Price is the last signal, not the first. By the time price confirms, insiders have already positioned. This is not unfair. It is how markets allocate value to those who tolerate uncertainty. The takeaway is not to believe blindly. It is to update your framework. Frameworks that treat XRP as a static. Speculative asset will fail to explain future behavior. Frameworks that treat it as evolving infrastructure will at least make sense of volatility and repricing. Even if outcomes differ from expectations, the market does not reward certainty. It rewards adaptability. And adaptability begins with recognizing when a whisper indicates a deeper change in how an asset is being perceived internally, because internal perception drives external outcomes long before public narratives catch up. This is why the whisper matters not as proof but as a clue that the system is quietly adjusting, and that adjustment may eventually make XRP far more valuable than most people currently believe, not because of hype, but because of necessity. Warrants attention, not action necessarily, but attention. Ignoring such signals, because they are not loud, is a mistake many retail participants make because they equate volume with importance. Insiders equate feasibility with importance. Feasibility is growing, and that growth is what underpins the idea of unbelievable value. Not a number on a chart, but a role in a system that cannot afford to fail. In the next part, we will go deeper into how this shift in role changes distribution access and market behavior, why insiders think in terms of scarcity differently than retail, and how whispers turn into outcomes long before headlines ever catch up.